Hi everyone, welcome back. I wanted to record this short video to talk a little bit more about secondary sources and the role that they play within an interpretive research project, okay? And this is to help give you a better sense of what kinds of articles you should be looking for that could be most helpful to your research project, and then how to incorporate them into the way that you're presenting your research. So let's get started. I'm going to start with a quick explainer or summary about the differences between a reference source and a secondary source, because this is where a lot of folks get tripped up. A reference source is a general overview. It's really descriptive. It's just telling you the people, places, basic historical information related to the topic of your choice. There's little to no primary source analysis. And so a really good example of reference sources are Wikipedia articles. They give you a lot of information. They point to secondary sources, which are the sources of their information, but they don't analyze primary sources themselves. They're not making explicit arguments based on their analysis. They're really kind of those descriptive overviews, like I said. So anything that comes from encyclopedia, so if you're looking at Britannica, if it's the encyclopedia of fill in the blank, in the title, you'll know that that's a reference source, okay? It's not a secondary source. A secondary source, on the other hand, are pieces, whether they're articles or podcast episodes or videos, that have an explicit thesis and an argument that they're making based on the analysis of primary source evidence or data, okay? So you'll notice that we have read some secondary sources throughout the class with our readings, right? Some of them have been reference sources, giving those general overviews, like any of the sources from the Gale ebooks. Those I would consider reference sources. Textbooks also are another form of a reference source. Secondary sources are those pieces more like the podcast episodes that are presenting a really particular argument about a topic. I would also say that many of the articles that were from Aon, the online publication, are also secondary sources. Those are researchers and scholars who have done close analysis of primary texts and are trying to make a point about why their topic of choice is historically significant, important, meaningful, and things like that, okay? So make sure that you're really clear on the difference between reference and secondary sources. Next, once you've identified your secondary sources, or you have the idea of the definition of secondary sources pretty solid in your head, what are they actually used for in a research project? Well, there are a number of different ways that you can use secondary sources in your historical research project, but I'm going to highlight the three main ones I think would be most useful for our purposes here. So the first is that you can use secondary sources as models or examples for analyzing primary sources. So for instance, if you find a secondary source article with a scholar who is analyzing ancient Greek poems, you can use the way that they approach their analysis as a model for how you analyze your primary sources that you find, okay? So if an author, for instance, a researcher, talks about how they focus their analysis on the second verse of a set of poems because the second verse has particular historical meaning, that can be an approach that you use for the poems that you would be analyzing. You could then just focus on the second verses and use the secondary source as your reason or your model or your support for why you're analyzing the source in the way that you did, okay? The second reason to use a primary source is that primary sources can give you deeper context about your topic, right? So where an overview article kind of gives you that, an overview reference source kind of gives you that broad view. A secondary source, particularly a journal article written by a researcher, is going to be a really deep dive into a really specific topic. And that can be important because it can provide deeper insights and details that you can use to help understand the context of your research topic. So again, if your research topic is about ancient Greek poetry, deeper context could be around the type of person who typically became poets in ancient Greek, right? And the role that they played in ancient Greek society. Okay, so you could have an article that focuses on a particular poet or set of poets and use the information from that article to give you a better understanding of the role and the fit of poets in Greek society. And the last use of secondary sources that I think is super helpful is they can be where you find more primary sources. So if you look at the footnotes or the end notes of that journal article, or even as you're reading through that secondary source, they're going to mention primary sources. And if it's a primary source that you think would be really important for your topic and the way that you're thinking about your own research project, see if you can track that down, copy parts of that citation, put it into Google and see if it pops up as part of a library collection or in a museum collection or in Project Gutenberg or these other spaces where that source might be available to you online. So it's kind of doing some of that backtracking, that reverse searching, as you will, using the secondary sources as a bibliography, as a list of other sources that could be helpful to you for your own project. Okay. And so the last thing that's really important about including secondary sources in your projects is that you're careful to attribute your secondary source and how and or why they are present for your project. Kind of what are they adding to it? So again, this is similar to what we've done throughout the class in the reading posts. If your final output of your project is written in some way, make sure that you're including like a line level or a paragraph level parenthetical citation to indicate that that secondary source is where you got that information, contributed to that insight of your analysis, things like that. If you're doing a podcast or a verbal presentation of some kind, make sure that you are verbally mentioning the name of the author and or the article title in the course of your presentation, okay? So you could say something like, as Sharp's article on secondary sources said, blah, blah, blah. You don't have to verbally say an entire citation, right? But the main bits of information to include verbally would be the same as what you would include if you were writing, which is name of the author, name of the article or the piece, and the date, if you can get that in there, okay? So with that, good luck. I hope this helps clarify for you secondary sources. And again, if you have any questions, please let me know. Take care.